Hello and welcome to the Zeitgeist podcast, where we select a handful of trending words and delve into how they affect narratives. My name is Khalid, Fadzillah, and I'm joined by my co-host Rauf. Rauf, how are you?
Doing good. Khalid, how are you doing?
Doing good, doing good. So, our previous episode, we covered certain aspects and semantics in relation to influencers, in the context of modern marketing, in modern infrastructure of social media, and how that plays a part in the economics of our lives. So I think this episode is going to be a little bit different. Still, I think within the range of the digital and modern infrastructures. And I think again we will be carrying out a lot of our episodes now, kind of using a blanket term that helps us to relate all of the other terms that we will be talking about in each segment. So I think, Rauf, maybe you can kickstart us with the mention of this theme.
Thank you. Yeah, as Khalid mentioned, the previous episode was about how social media is changing communications. And aside from that, how influencers are being influenced by their fans through this two-way communication in this Web 2.0 era and parasocial relationships and stuff like that. This next episode is called Corporate Narratives and Personal Branding, Redefining Leadership in the Digital Era. And it's about how there's this shift happening, okay, in how companies and corporations communicate with the public, especially I think particularly due to the rise of LinkedIn, right? And the personal branding of the executive. Right. This is something that has very, very interesting history, and it goes back. I think the first person who ever personal branded himself, basically as an executive, was Rockefeller. After the mining incident, I think the miners' strike. Anyway, so as an introduction to this episode, in the digital era, corporate narratives are undergoing a transformation, increasingly shaped by digital branding and sustainability messaging. Sustainability is a part of it. How are executives leveraging personal branding to redefine corporate leadership, and how are rebranding strategies and the role of digital leadership changing corporate identities for effective corporate narratives in today's complex and competitive marketplace? And we have a bunch of keywords. I think, as Khalid mentioned, we focus on semantics and business terms or words that make up these narratives, these shifting narratives. The words for this episode, the keywords for this episode: digital branding, identity, personal brand statement, CSR, corporate social responsibility, sustainability messaging. I came up with a term as well called puppet brands. So maybe we can try to unpack that a bit. Rebranding strategies, corporate personal brands, executive branding, personal public relations, and digital leadership. These are a lot of keywords, and they're basically very related to each other. By the way, for new viewers, please subscribe if you like what we're doing over here at Zeitgeist. Okay, so taking it back again, as I mentioned, the branding of the executive, as far as I know, began with Rockefeller after the miners' strike. So there was this era in corporate history where basically these business magnates and business titans did not really have to care what the public thought of them, right? They didn't have to care. They had small armies. I mean, you go back to the era of colonialism, right? With the East India Company and stuff. Companies were sort of tethered to governments, and they basically had the green light to do whatever they whatever they wanted, right? In this era of hyper attention, basically, like I think we talked previously about the Arab Spring uprising, which was basically a Twitter uprising, right? People being able to watch, and the individual person basically being a watchdog, right, on what companies are doing and stuff like that, right? So after the miners' strike, basically there was, I think, one of Rockefeller's mines. His workers revolted, and Rockefeller called in an army, his own personal army, and there was a brutal crackdown and all that. And I think people died, and Rockefeller had to communicate his perspective to the public and show himself as a good guy and stuff like that. So this can possibly be seen as one of the pivotal points of public relations for executives, branding themselves, right? Related to that, today especially, is sustainability and the core message of having to fit into the idea of making the world a better place in terms of environmental consciousness and stuff like that. Khalid, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to unpack there. First and foremost, I think this is a topic of corporate narratives, and inadvertently, it's a topic on narratives. I mean, this entire podcast is predicated on the idea of narratives. Me and Rauf have an ongoing theory called the theory of dynamic narrative, which is basically this idea that every narrative that is constructed will have one or multiple opposing narratives that exist to strike down that constructed narrative. And so there is an ongoing dynamic between narratives that are constructed and narratives that are set to oppose those constructed narratives. And that's something that happens kind of as a dichotomy or a spectrum. Going back to the history of corporate narratives and why corporations actually had to focus on the communicative aspect of business and enterprise. Rauf mentioned Rockefeller. That's interesting. I think going further back than Rockefeller, one of the first personal brands to actually exist was by Da Vinci, who sent letterheads out to royal families, if I'm not mistaken, to sell himself with a portfolio of products, with a portfolio of talents and services that he could provide during the war. So that's something that's quite interesting as well. And I think when we talk about corporate narratives, there is, as Rauf mentioned again, this shift of collective corporate narrative and a personal corporate narrative, aka the personal brand. We're seeing a lot of this trending now on LinkedIn. We're doing it, you're doing it, everyone's doing it. We're selling ourselves in terms of our professional selves online, on digital media, what we can do in terms of our talent and our services that we can provide, and things like this. So I think that there's a lot of dichotomies. I think Louis Hyman, the great scholar, he mentioned that the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, they constantly have a push and pull between who gets more power and who does, and such things throughout history. As you mentioned, I think Andrew Carnegie, the steel magnate, Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, and the rise of all of these industrialists throughout the 1700s, 1800s saw a lot of violence because corporations could do whatever they wanted, and the proletariat was essentially helpless. But throughout since then, there have been a lot of shifting back and forth. I think in the 70s and 80s, I think the power shifted back to the proletariat. Employees got a lot more power in terms of union laws, and policies were shifting towards their favor. And then when the gig economy and the startup economy and the tech economies actually started to rise again, inadvertently what happened was that the shift went back to the employers. Louis Hyman talks a little bit about this, and so does do other experts like Tim Wu and other authors. So there are interesting dichotomies that exist all around. Yeah.
What do you mean by the dichotomy shifted back to the employers during the gig economy times? And
that's an interesting one. So yeah, Louis Hyman was talking about this, the hidden. So this is a narrative that's constructed by people like these experts, and there are of course opposing narratives. But the constructed narrative here is that trends like the gig economy, for example, they have a hidden. There is a hidden component, not necessarily deliberate, but there is a hidden component in the gig economy, where employers are less liable to take care of their employees in terms of benefits, in terms of legal proceedings, in terms of labor-driven precautionary proceedings.
Sort of what you're mentioning about the privatization of profit and the outsourcing of risk or something like that.
That's Louis Hyman, right? He very interestingly, he says, the corporation will always, he says something along the lines of the corporation will always want to privatize profits and, democratize risk in order that they may gain stability and gain power. And again, that's a constructed narrative that can have opposing narratives, but there's a lot of interesting things there.
There's this also this idea, I think I read somewhere, that every company should only have one, maximum two sort of figureheads who go out there and speak for the company. And you can see this with, for example, one with Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk, right? One person, right? This goes back to the psychology of crowds. Gustave Le Bon, he wrote this book called I think it's called The Psychology of Crowds or The Crowd, something like that. And basically, if I'm not mistaken, he mentioned that one aspect of crowds, like when human beings get together in a crowd, it sort of becomes like another creature, right? And one thing about this sort of creature is that it is very visual, right? And it requires a figurehead, Napoleon Bonaparte or Jeff Bezos, one figurehead that it can relate to, right? And so this idea of you being the spokesperson for your brand, or at the maximum, apparently two, and with the two, you can sort of see that with Grab, Anthony Tan, and I think his COO, they were often seen together. But I think this is not as common. Another one maybe is the Winklevoss twins, right? Two of them, two brothers, right? With us as well, two brothers. Right. So maximum two apparently is the benchmark.
And I think this is a fantastic way for us to kind of see what we mean by constructed narratives and opposing narratives. If we can just linger on this one because it's interesting. And also it segues into this idea of the transitional point that we are at right now, where collective branding is kind of transitioning to personal branding. A lot of people, and I think the idea of personal branding kind of propagated and was exacerbated in some ways with the likes of Steve Jobs, for example, who absolute Goliath of a personal brand that led great companies like Apple and Pixar, right? And of course the Winklevoss twins and the Wright brothers and so on and so forth. But at the same time, you have this opposing narrative where you have some of the most powerful companies in the world right now. Accenture, for example, Accenture is a gigantic company with tentacles all around the world. Last year, 2023, they garnered about $64 billion in total revenue. They have hundreds of thousands of employees all around the world in at least 120 different economies. Can you name me the person at the top of Accenture? Is there a personal brand around him? We spoke the other day about McKinsey and how, well, McKinsey itself is based off of the brand of McKinsey, but he's long gone, and I don't really know who's really in charge. A lot of these people keep away from public eye anyway. So there are two types of companies that we can see. One where it's clear who the figurehead is, and then one where it's not very clear. And it's difficult to say which is better than the other. That's kind of the interesting thing.
I think there's a purpose for this. You mentioned Accenture and McKinsey. These are not like you said, like you were mentioning, with the tentacles like all over the world, and with they're in the shadows for a reason, and part of their brand, a part of the way they do business is being in the shadows, right? Compare that to you mentioned Steve Jobs. You mentioned, I'm going to take it a little bit further and include Larry Fink from BlackRock as well, right? I mentioned Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk. So let's put Larry Fink and Steve Jobs in there as well. Can you see a connection between these different figureheads, right? These are heads. Basically, these are heads, right? They and others like them are heads of public listed companies, right? And these public listed companies, right? They function differently, man. Like through a statement released by a well followed or a CEO with a large following, right? Through one statement, markets can shift. Right? Stock prices can go up or down, right? And these are valuation-driven entities, right? They're not really in the business of revenue and making money through revenue and stuff. You get what I mean? The influence of market movements and communication from these top CEOs, right? There's a connection there.
Exactly. Yeah. So that was the valid conclusion that we came to. We had a discussion about this in the past about why some companies are so very prevalent or so very insistent on having huge figureheads that, and it mostly boils down to perception, right? You have Elon Musk making a tweet that can move entire markets, shut down Bitcoin, and overnight. Gigantic market fluctuations happen when you have a figurehead where everyone is looking at that direction and they can do things with that. So that's something, and also it's kind of again this dichotomy between the public listed company and the private company. The private company does not have the same incentive to focus so very intensely on figureheads that they would require it to that extent. But public listed companies, well, that's a different kind of story, right? They much more focus on the idea of perception in the markets, much more focus on the idea of price earnings or valuation, from the financial aspect. So that's something to take into account. Very interesting.
Right. So we're coming up to the end of this episode. Let me just touch briefly on the CSR, corporate social responsibility, and the sustainability messaging aspect. And also, I think it's pretty important to bring in the rebranding strategy aspect. Now, as I mentioned, corporations are changing. Corporate narrative building is changing towards the individual executive, right? And I mentioned either one or two main executives who are featured as sort of the figureheads of the companies, right? And this necessitates a rebrand. As Khalid mentioned, right, focusing on individual personal branding for executives is not necessarily always important, and particularly it is related to whether the company is public or private, right? This can influence how important focusing on individual executives can be. So, as I mentioned, this can really necessitate a rebranding strategy and rebranding exactly how the corporation or the corporate entity decides to position itself and communicate, and basically that's what we do over at Palindrome. And on top of that, just to touch on a little bit, the corporate social responsibility and sustainability aspect, as I mentioned, Rockefeller's individual executive personal branding activities basically started when he had to position himself as the good guy, right? Now, what it means to be the good guy changes according to the time, right? Basically, in terms of how corporations function these days, right? Today, a large part of it is what are you doing for the environment? What are you doing for human rights and stuff like that? So these are related to sustainability and ESG measures. And that's why if you're out there, I think you can find a lot of top executives and these kinds of people talking about these issues, right? So as action points for this episode, corporate narratives and personal branding, we talked about Steve Jobs, right? Steve Jobs, I think you might have heard this before. He had a very specific way of dressing, had a very specific way of talking and stuff like that. So, first of all, determining whether your company does indeed require personal branding, and then who the executive is who is going to be stepping forward. Like I said, either one or two, right? And then on top of that, personal branding for that executive in terms of how he or she dresses, speaks, and all this, right? And then necessitating a rebrand of the entire corporate communication flow to fit with this new direction. So I hope you enjoyed this episode, Corporate Narratives and Personal Branding. This is Zeitgeist. This is Rauf, and I'm joined by my co-host Khalid. Both of us are from Palindrome. And thank you for watching the Zeitgeist podcast. Stay tuned to the next episode. Thank you.